In the spring of 1944, inside Berlin, German intelligence officers leaned over a long conference table buried under reconnaissance photographs, intercepted radio traffic, and carefully annotated maps. They weren't comparing supply dumps or counting Allied landing craft. They were hunting for a single signature, one man's Patton, because they had come to believe that, if they could locate him, they could locate the future. The name that kept resurfacing in their reports was George S. Patton, and the obsession wasn't theatrical, it was operational. For months, German headquarters had poured more attention into tracking Patton than they did into tracking the Allied command structure itself. Not Eisenhower, the architect of the entire coalition. Not Montgomery, the steady British field marshal who had chased Rommel across North Africa. Patton was the one they treated like a moving storm front. Invisible one day, catastrophic the next. At the top of the western chain, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt watched the same stream of intelligence with growing unease. Anything that hinted at Patton's location was stamped urgent, passed upward, and discussed as if it were a codebook to Allied intentions. Rundstedt had fought opponents across Europe. He knew competent generals. But Patton felt different, less like a man and more like a tempo, a rhythm that could rupture plans before they were even fully written. German officers would later say, without exaggeration, that Patton frightened them. They had noticed him early. In November of 1942, during Operation Torch, an American force hit the coast of Morocco, America's first major ground entry into war against the Axis. Patton commanded the Western Task Force, bringing tens of thousands ashore. German commanders watched the landings with a professional's cold curiosity. The way predators study unfamiliar prey, they expected the Americans to move the way Americans were supposed to move, methodically, carefully, with overwhelming firepower before each step forward. That assumption lasted only days. Patton's advance came fast, almost rude in its speed. In a matter of a few days, Casablanca was secured and French resistance folded. German observers reported an American general who moved with a pace that didn't match the stereotype they had built in their heads. The tempo was the message. If the Americans were capable of producing a commander who fought like that, then the war in the West might not unfold according to German expectations. Requests for more information started flowing. In the Mediterranean theater, German command wanted Patton's background, his habits, his weaknesses, anything that could be turned into prediction. Reports came back with details that made the Germans uneasy for a deeper reason than speed. Patton had spent years studying German military theory, not casually, but intensely reading the doctrine, absorbing the logic, learning the language of maneuver warfare from the people who had written it. He had walked old battlefields, traced the ground where armies had broken and bled, and he treated history like rehearsal. German officers recognized something unsettling in that. Patton understood how they thought because he had deliberately trained himself to think that way. He didn't merely react to German methods, he anticipated them. Then came February of 1943. In Tunisia, German forces under Rommel smashed into inexperienced American lines at Kasserine Pass. The result was chaos. Units buckled, formations collapsed, and frightened troops fled in panic. It was the worst American defeat of the war, and German commanders watched closely, almost patiently, because defeats reveal character. They wanted to see what America would do next. Would the Americans retreat into caution? Would they blame equipment, blame leadership, lose nerve? The German staff waited for a familiar pattern: confusion, delay, and a slow rebuilding that would take months. The answer arrived in early March, and it arrived like a slammed door. George Patton took over the Second Corps, the same battered force that had crumpled at Kasserine. German intelligence officers monitoring the front expected gradual improvement, a little more discipline here, a stronger defensive posture there. What they saw instead shocked them. In roughly 2 weeks, the atmosphere changed. The same soldiers who had run now attacked. Patrols probed German lines with a sharpness and aggression that hadn't been there before. Discipline snapped into place. Morale stopped sagging and started hardening. Units reported as combat ineffective suddenly moved like they had purpose again. German reconnaissance described an American front that had developed teeth overnight. This wasn't reinforcements, this wasn't new equipment. It was command presence, the invisible weight of a commander who demanded speed, order, and violence. Even Rommel noticed. In his notes, He recorded that the Americans had become more dangerous, and the speed of the transformation was the clue. Something had changed too quickly to be explained by logistics. Someone new was in charge. By July of 1943, the war rolled into Sicily. The Allied plan placed Montgomery's 8th Army in the spotlight, intended to drive up the eastern side toward Messina, while Patton's 7th Army was assigned a supporting role covering the flank, holding ground, protecting the larger design. Patton didn't treat the role as a cage. He drove across the western half of the island with a pace that startled allies and enemies alike. His columns moved so hard that timelines shattered. German units attempting to evacuate across the Strait of Messina realized they were no longer withdrawing on schedule. They were racing. Withdrawal plans that assumed days began collapsing into hours. Evacuation became frantic, ugly, and improvisational, because Patton's movement threatened to cut escape routes before the Germans could clear them. And then came the moment that burned itself into reputations. Patton reached Messina ahead of Montgomery, despite starting farther away and fighting through brutal terrain and resistance. He had covered a staggering distance in a little over a month while pushing through constant combat. German after-action reports used a tone that mixed professional respect with genuine alarm. One officer wrote, in essence, that Patton fought like a panzer commander, bold, opportunistic, and uncomfortably fast. He took risks American doctrine didn't encourage. He exploited weaknesses before defenders could even reorganize. He didn't feel like the enemy they had prepared for. He felt like an enemy who spoke their language. Then, in August of 1943, at the height of his success, Patton did something that nearly destroyed his own career and, for a moment, handed Germany a gift they hadn't earned. He visited evacuation hospitals in Sicily and encountered soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, men broken by prolonged exposure to terror and exhaustion. Patton, shaped by an older, harsher understanding of war, saw cowardice where we would now recognize trauma. In a flash of anger, he struck one soldier. Days later, he struck another, this time escalating into a threat that included drawing his pistol. The incidents reached Eisenhower, who exploded with fury. Patton was reprimanded, humiliated, and forced into apologies. When the story leaked, the public outcry was immediate. Newspapers demanded his removal. Politicians called him unfit. The general, who had just delivered a brilliant campaign, suddenly looked like a liability. German intelligence watched the scandal unfold, like men watching a fuse burn toward a target. They had identified Patton as the most dangerous American commander, the one who moved too fast to contain. Now the Americans might remove him themselves. German officers almost couldn't believe it. A self-inflicted wound. A threat neutralized by his own side. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Patton would be sent home in disgrace, and Germany would never have to face his tempo again. But Eisenhower didn't fire him. He punished him, yes, severely, and kept him out of public command. Yet he did not discard him. To German eyes, that decision carried a different kind of meaning. If the Americans still valued Patton despite the scandal, then they were saving him. And if they were saving him, then they were saving him for something decisive. By early 1944, Patton was in England, visible enough to be tracked, but strangely absent from any obvious combat role. German intelligence followed him obsessively. They knew he was there. They knew he wasn't commanding the forces that would clearly spearhead the coming invasion. That only deepened the mystery. If Patton was not being wasted, then where was he meant to strike? German analysts reasoned from their own logic. You do not leave your best weapon unused when the war is about to turn. Therefore, wherever Patton was stationed, that location must point to the main assault. That belief was the hinge on which one of the greatest deceptions of the war would swing. Unknown to the Germans, the 1st United States Army Group Patton's supposed command was a phantom. It existed in radio traffic, on paper, in carefully staged photographs, and in the imaginations of men who wanted it to be real. Dummy tanks, made of inflatable rubber-dotted fields, plywood buildings suggested headquarters activity. Fake units moved through disciplined transmissions. It was theater engineered for one audience, German intelligence. And it worked because of a single assumption: the Germans could not let go of the assumption that Patton would lead the main invasion. The deception did not merely suggest a landing point. It exploited an obsession. It weaponized fear. German High Command became convinced that the real landing would come at Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing from England to France. It made strategic sense on paper, and it made psychological sense because Patton was there at least. Patton was there, in the narrative the Germans had built. So they positioned their best reserves near Calais. They reinforced defenses. They held back armored divisions meant to smash an invasion before it could breathe. They waited for Patton the way a man waits for thunder he can't see but knows is coming. Then came June 6, 1944. Allied forces hit Normandy far to the southwest of Calais. The invasion Hitler had expected for years finally arrived, and yet German command hesitated, not because they didn't understand danger, but because they couldn't decide whether the danger was real. Was Normandy the main blow, or was it bait meant to drag reserves south while Patton struck at Calais with the true hammer? Rundstedt wanted to release armored reserves quickly to crush the beachhead while it was still fragile, but command authority was tangled in Hitler's rigid control and in the intoxicating fear that Patton might be waiting to strike elsewhere. Hitler and his staff clung to the belief that Normandy could be a feint and that the decisive invasion would still come at Calais. And so, for critical weeks, German panzer divisions sat in place, held back, immobilized, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked certainty. Those weeks mattered. They were the difference between a landing being drowned in the surf and a landing becoming a continent-wide breakthrough. German armor that might have driven the Allies into the sea remained frozen, guarding a coastline where no invasion came. The deception held not for hours, but for long enough to change the war's trajectory. And it held because the Germans could not accept a reality in which George Patton was not at the center of the most important battle in the West. In their minds, leaving Patton out of the main event was like discarding your sharpest blade on the night you need it most. They simply could not believe it. Patton finally returned to combat command on August 1, 1944. He was given the Third Army, and when he entered the fight, it felt less like a deployment and more like an unleashed force. In the opening weeks, Third Army covered ground at a pace that made previous months of grinding Normandy fighting look almost static. Patton's divisions raced through Brittany, then pivoted east, turning motion into pressure, pressure into collapse. German units that had held defensive lines suddenly discovered Americans behind them cutting supply routes, appearing near headquarters, threatening encirclement before commanders could even update their maps. The German command structure in western France began to fracture. Communications broke, orders contradicted one another. Commanders lost track of where the front even was, because Patton kept moving it. By mid-August, Patton saw an opportunity that could end the campaign in France with one decisive closure. German armies were retreating through a narrowing gap near Falaise. If the Allies could pinch that corridor shut, hundreds of thousands could be trapped. Patton drove north while Canadian and Polish forces pushed from other directions. The pocket tightened like a fist. Inside, German units panicked. Vehicles were abandoned. Columns dissolved into crowds. Officers lost control. The destruction became catastrophic. Tens of thousands captured, thousands more killed, and a level of equipment loss that hollowed out German capacity in France. Survivors later compared it to Stalingrad in its feeling of doom, but with one crucial difference. At Stalingrad, they said, there had been time to understand what was happening. With Patton, there was no time. You realized too late, and then the trap was already closing. After the war, Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals and asked questions that cut through propaganda. Which Allied commanders did you respect? Which did you fear? The answers, again and again, came back with a strange consistency. Montgomery was described as methodical and predictable, careful, deliberate, slow to move without preparation. That predictability made him easier to oppose, because German commanders could anticipate what he would attempt next and arrange defenses accordingly. Bradley was seen as competent but cautious, a man who would not gamble wildly. But Patton was described with a different vocabulary: unpredictable, aggressive, dangerous. German commanders said he made decisions faster than opponents could react. He attacked when doctrine suggested consolidation. He advanced when logistics suggested pausing. He took risks his superiors sometimes disliked and his enemies learned to dread. One German panzer commander would later say that Patton had the instincts of a German armored leader, and that was not meant as a compliment to German pride. It was a confession of what made him terrifying. The Germans respected Rommel because Rommel was bold and unconventional. In Patton, they saw a similar brutality of imagination, except it was aimed at them. Then came December of 1944, and Germany made its last great gamble in the West. A massive offensive through the Ardennes that caught Allied commanders off balance. Within days, American forces were in retreat. The situation became desperate. Bastogne was surrounded. Winter closed in with its ice, its fog, its dead roads, its slow cruelty. Eisenhower convened an emergency meeting and asked the question that reveals a commander's soul. How quickly can you counterattack? Most generals spoke in weeks. Armies needed time to pivot, to move fuel, to move ammunition, to reorient supply lines. Patton said 2 days. He said he could attack in 48 hours with multiple divisions. People in the room thought it was showmanship. You could not rotate an army, swing it 90 degrees, and launch a major strike in the middle of winter on that timeline. The logistics alone sounded impossible, but Patton had already prepared. His intelligence staff had treated the Ardennes threat as plausible when others dismissed it. Contingency plans had been quietly drafted. Routes had been considered. Priorities had been outlined. Patton was not improvising in the meeting. He was revealing that he had been thinking ahead, while others believed the front was stable. He made the call, and within hours the Third Army began its pivot north. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, icy roads, winter conditions that punished every mistake. The Germans expected the Allies to take time. They expected delay. Instead, Patton was already moving into their flank before their own assumptions had cooled. The relief of Bastogne came on December 26th. The offensive meant to split the Allied armies was halted, and German commanders understood again that their mental model of Patton's speed had been wrong from the start. After the war, when German generals were asked what went wrong in the Ardennes, many gave the same answer. They hadn't expected Patton to respond that fast. They thought they had more time. It was the same mistake they had been making since North Africa, underestimating the tempo, underestimating how quickly he could turn intent into movement. So why did German commanders fear Patton more than any other Allied general? Part of the answer lay in doctrine. German military thinking prized speed, aggression, and exploitation, the logic behind blitzkrieg, the belief that shock and motion could break an enemy's coherence faster than attrition could. German commanders understood that style instinctively. Patton understood it too, not by accident, but by study. He had absorbed their philosophy for decades and then used it against them. When he took command, he fought the way German generals wished they could fight, except he did it with Allied resources, Allied air power, and an enemy that could not accept that the Americans had produced a commander who operated on German terms. But there was another reason, quieter and more brutal. German commanders could predict most Allied behavior. They knew the British and American systems, the caution, the preference for preparation, the reliance on massed firepower and planned advances. Patton broke the pattern. He advanced when others would pause. He attacked when others would fortify. He treated time like ammunition, something you spent to kill the enemy's ability to think. And because he didn't follow the expected rules, the Germans never knew what he would do next. They only knew it would be fast, violent, and expensive. Rundstedt, who had commanded German forces in the West and had faced the full weight of the Allied coalition, summed it up after the war with a clarity that sounded almost like resignation. Patton, he said, was a supreme master of mobile warfare, a brilliant practitioner of offensive tactics, and the Allied commander they feared the most. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of France and the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Patton earned that fear the hard way by repeatedly appearing where he shouldn't have been, moving faster than planners said was possible, and turning German certainty into German panic. In the end, the commanders who had conquered Europe learned what it felt like to face an enemy who fought the way they fought, only better and only faster, and with no patience for the comforting illusion that tomorrow would be safer than today. German generals who survived the war carried Patton with them long after the guns fell silent. In interrogations, memoirs, and private conversations, his name surfaced again and again, not as propaganda, not as exaggeration, but as a professional assessment. For men who had spent their lives studying war, who had crushed Poland in weeks and France in days, fear was not an emotion they admitted lightly. Yet when they spoke of Patton, their language shifted. They talked about pressure, about never having time, about an enemy who refused to slow down long enough to be contained. They described a commander who made their carefully prepared plans obsolete the moment they were finished. What disturbed them most was not Patton's aggressiveness alone. Aggression could be countered. What unsettled them was his instinct for momentum. German doctrine had always emphasized that a broken enemy must never be given time to recover. Blitzkrieg was not just speed, it was relentless exploitation. Once a seam appeared, you forced it open before your opponent could react. German generals recognized that Patton understood this truth at a visceral level. He did not treat victories as endpoints. He treated them as launch platforms. Every success became fuel for the next movement. Every collapse, an invitation to push harder. Against such an opponent, there was no safe pause. Even when Patton was constrained by fuel shortages, by political decisions, by cautious superiors, the Germans sensed that he was merely waiting, coiled rather than stopped. They learned that if Patton went quiet, it did not mean he was inactive. It meant he was preparing to strike in a direction they had not yet considered. This uncertainty gnawed at German command staffs. War is brutal, but it is survivable when it follows patterns. Patton shattered patterns. He turned the front into something fluid and unpredictable, a living thing that shifted before maps could be updated. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed inward under the weight of Allied pressure, Patton's presence remained a psychological force multiplier. German units facing Third Army often assumed the worst, that Patton was already maneuvering behind them, that escape routes were already threatened, that delay meant disaster. This belief accelerated collapse. Orders were abandoned. Positions were vacated prematurely. Panic spread faster than Allied columns. In this way, Patton did not merely defeat German units physically, he defeated them mentally. He compressed time so violently that commanders felt permanently late, always reacting instead of acting. Ironically, this same quality that terrified the Germans also created friction within the Allied command. Patton's impatience with caution, his disdain for hesitation, and his belief that speed itself saved lives by shortening wars, put him at odds with leaders who valued control and predictability. Eisenhower understood Patton's value, but he also understood the danger of letting him run entirely free. Patton was a weapon that required careful handling, not because he was ineffective, but because he was almost too effective. Unchecked, he could outrun logistics, politics, and alliances. Controlled, he became decisive. German commanders sensed this tension and hoped it might limit him. They watched for signs that Patton would be restrained, sidelined, or exhausted by Allied bureaucracy. But again and again, when crisis hit, Patton was unleashed. In moments of danger, Allied leaders turned to speed. And speed meant Patton. After Germany's surrender, as officers reflected on the war's turning points, many came to the same quiet conclusion. Germany had not been defeated by numbers alone, nor by industry alone, nor even by air power alone. It had been defeated by momentum, by an enemy that refused to let Germany recover from shock. Patton embodied that refusal. Where other commanders consolidated, he pursued. Where others paused to reorganize, he advanced. Where others waited for perfect conditions, he created chaos under imperfect ones. To German eyes, this made Patton uniquely dangerous. He did not give them the kind of war they were prepared to fight. He did not allow defensive lines to stabilize. He did not respect the invisible boundaries that doctrine suggested should exist between phases of combat. Instead, he treated war as continuous motion. And motion, when fast enough, becomes overwhelming. Even Patton's flaws, his temper, his arrogance, his refusal to soften his language, fed the mythos that surrounded him. German intelligence officers reading intercepted statements or reports saw not a polished diplomat general, but a brutal, impatient warrior obsessed with offense. This image reinforced their belief that Patton would always attack, always push, always exploit. In a strange way, his reputation became another weapon. German commanders reacted not only to what Patton did, but to what they feared he might do next. When historians later tried to explain Patton's impact, many focused on his personality, his speeches, his profanity, his dramatic flair. But German generals saw past the theatrics. They judged him the way professionals judge one another, by outcomes and by pressure, and by those measures, Patton stood apart. He forced mistakes. He created dilemmas. He robbed opponents of time, which in war is often more valuable than territory. In the end, Patton did not win the war alone. No general did. But from the German perspective, he represented something deeply unsettling. Proof that the Allies had learned their lessons faster than Germany expected. Proof that American commanders could fight wars of movement, not just wars of material. Proof that the doctrine Germany had once used to dominate Europe could be turned against it with ruthless efficiency. That is why, when German officers were asked to name the Allied commander they feared most, they did not hesitate. They did not say the supreme commander. They did not say the careful planner. They said Patton, not because he was reckless, but because he understood their game and played it without mercy. He fought them on their own terms, stripped of illusions, accelerated beyond comfort, and driven by the belief that hesitation was the deadliest enemy of all. By the time the war ended, German generals had learned a bitter lesson. They had once believed speed belonged to them. They had believed shock was their monopoly. Facing George Patton forced them to confront a reality they never wanted to accept, that the enemy had learned how to move faster than they could think, and in modern war, that realization is often the last one a defeated army ever has.